story of Grace Woodlands begins actually before we ever purchased this property, when we were building a large campus on the freeway at Grace Church, Houston, building a 10,000-seat auditorium. And we had some people that had moved to the Woodlands, and they asked us if we would put a campus on this side of the city. So I came up and I began to look for property. And I looked all over the area, and I would keep driving by this particular site. There was an old gate out front, and there was a sign, not a real, like a realtor sign, but just an old sign that had been there for many, many years. And I never called or anything on that. And one day I pulled into the little drive-in that you could pull in, and I got the number, and I called about this property, and I began to negotiate with the owner of this property, as well as where our billboard sign is, and some acreage behind that. Our church organization, Grace International, actually purchased the original amount of acreage that we bought. And Grace Church Houston, we began to pursue the development of this land, and the establishing of Grace Woodlands paid for by Grace Church Houston. We sponsored that. When we bought this land, I heard later that there were actually people here in the Woodlands who laughed at us because this site was a bunch of abandoned sand pits. They'd used up, taken all the sand out, the land was used up, and it was abandoned. It was over 80 acres. And when the land became abandoned, then people began to dump things on the property. I've joked over the years that you actually could furnish your house from this property. There were couches and chairs and tables and washers and dryers and refrigerators, even an abandoned car. There was at one point a marijuana farm on this property. So there were all kinds of things that happened, and that happens when a property becomes used up and then abandoned. Then typically it becomes a dumping site. And I've said over the years that the story of this property is the story of grace. Our ministry is to people whose lives, they've given their lives to something, and it didn't work out. It's not like they thought. And instead of finding what they were looking for, bondage came. They got used up. The system chewed them up. Sin chewed them up. And with that, they became useless. And in that abandoned state, then sin has a way of dumping on us, and our lives become more known by the dregs that have attached themselves to us than by our identity that the Lord gives us. When we saw this property, when we purchased it, I saw something here of potential. That's what God sees in all of us. No matter how used up we are, no matter how broken by sin we are, God sees potential in all of our lives. And I began to dream about what this land could be. And over the years, I would draw different layouts of what could be. And then ultimately we began to redeem the property, and we built the first building, which is the place you're worshiping in right now. A multi-purpose building. It wasn't really big and it wasn't really fancy, but it began the process of us establishing value once again. What was used up and abandoned and thrown away and had become a dumping ground, now it began to have some value. When Exxon announced they were going to move across the freeway, I began to look at this site even in a way that would increase its value. And so over the last number of years, those sand pits that were used up, we filled those in now. We've brought in, the best we know, about 3.5 million yards of dirt, spread it, compacted it, and there's been a miracle story of how all of that took place. And now you can see by looking around here at what God has done. Right behind me, there's a 16-acre lake that will be an amenity for this property. You can see the new hotel that's under construction and 300 apartments that are just being finished. When you drive in every week, you can see the Lexus property built on 21 acres, the premier Lexus dealership in the country. You can see the skilled nursing center that's at the north end of our property. And you can see the credit union that's out front.
Hello, Grace family. My name is Tim Carmoude. I'm the General Sales Manager here at Northside Lexus, just next to Grace Church. I want to thank Pastor Steve for giving me the opportunity to testify of the goodness of the Lord. I just want to tell you a little bit of our history here. We started this dealership about 21 years ago. I've been with the company for 24 years, and to be honest with you, I've never experienced or seen anything like the last year and a half. We opened up the doors in September of 2019, a year and a half ago, and each month after we opened, we had record months for 6 months straight. And then of course the pandemic happened and we slowed down for about 2.5 months. But since then, even with a pandemic year, we've had the best year in the history of our store. That is only a testament of God's grace and God's goodness. When we start looking for property, this was the first one that came to mind because of the potential that it had. But a lot of people, a lot of naysayers were saying, you guys are crazy for building on this land, because in the prior years it just looked like swampland. But God has redeemed it, obviously, and here we are. Now there's development going all around us, and I just felt in my spirit when they told me that they have finally settled on this land, I leaped inside of me because I knew that it was going to be a blessing to us and to all the employees that work here, and a blessing to the community. So I want to thank Grace. I want to thank the pastors. I want to also thank my family here for praying and for supporting us. Before we opened the doors, I had a group of prayer warriors that came over here with some of the pastoral staff that prayed over the property, prayed over the departments, each and every department. We walked through the whole dealership and prayed over the land before we opened up. So the fact that we just had one of the best years in history with the pandemic happening is just a testament of God's grace. So I give God the glory. I thank you for your support. I thank you for your prayers.
This is a God story. It's what God does. And if you want a good illustration of redemption, just that 1 acre out front where the credit union is, we sold that 1 acre to the credit union for what we paid for the whole original 80+ acres piece of property. That's a God story. And that's what God does for you. That's what the ministry of this church is all about. It is about taking in broken people, looking at their lives not by what they have become, but by what they can be by the power of God. And then people like you and me, investing our resources, investing our time, giving our hearts. And as we do all of that, people respond to that message. And as they respond to that message, there comes the transforming power of a living God who begins to reshape them and form them and make them what they could never be. So every time you drive on this property, I want you to know that this property is the story of grace. I hope today you'll You'll watch this and you'll watch it again and again until every time you drive on, when you see all of the development that's going on, you'll give praise to the Lord. For one reason, because He has given us this, and it is a great future for our congregation. But beyond that, far more important than that, it's the story of the ministry of what God wants to do through a people called Grace.